Welcome back, students. Today we're going to talk about courtroom basics. This is a slideshow that will provide you with some basic information about how the court system works and introduce some important terminology that we'll revisit over the course of our judicial branch unit. The first question I want to begin with, follow along on your notes, is what is the overall purpose of courts and the court system in our country and in our government? Please make sure that you know that courts serve essentially two important purposes. One is to interpret the law. You know that the judicial branch's role is interpreting the law, but what that means is they take a law, which is written out in a very broad and theoretical way, and they apply that to a real-life situation. And this is essentially what happens when a judge and jury decide whether or not a person is guilty of breaking a law or not. So this is one realm where the court system performs a really important role for us. The other important role, the other area that the courts serve is in resolving disputes. Two people can be in an argument or in a dispute with one another over things like property or damages, custody of children. These are situations where nobody's really broken the law, but the two can't figure out which one of them is right. Courts can step in these cases and make a resolution for those parties and settle that dispute. So because there are these two areas that the courts handle, there are two areas of law. One area is called criminal law, and this is the law or the case that would involve somebody breaking the law or being accused of breaking the law and figuring out whether or not that person is guilty. And then you've got civil law, which is that part of the law that covers settling disputes between two arguing parties. So take a second, now that you know the difference between these two, come up in your own mind an example of each one of these. It can be a real or hypothetical example of a criminal case, or it can be a real or hypothetical example of a civil case. I want to make sure that you understand the difference and know how to apply that difference in these two areas of law to real life. So now that you've done that, let's move into talking about the people who are involved in a court case. So you've got a short list of people here and some notes about their role in a given case. On your notes, I want you to notice that there's a description. Read that description carefully and see if you can match it up with one of these individuals, one of these roles. Let's run through them. So the roles are going to change to a certain degree whether or not you're dealing with a criminal case or a civil case. In a criminal case, you have a person accused of breaking the law, and then a person sort of representing the law. The prosecutor is the side of the case that represents the people, and what their job is essentially to compile evidence that shows that the accused broke the law, present that in court to get a guilty charge. And meanwhile, on the other side of the case is the defendant. This is the actual person accused of committing that crime, and they are there with their lawyer, essentially trying to protect themselves and get a not guilty verdict. So these are the two sides that you'll see in a criminal case. In the civil case, you also have two sides, but in this case, remember, no one's really broken the law, so there's no prosecution, but there is a plaintiff. This is the person who is claiming that they were wronged or damaged in some way. And then there's the defendant, who is the individual who's accused of doing that wrong act, committing that damage. So make sure that you understand what both sides are called in criminal cases and civil cases. The other individuals and groups that you're going to see in courts include the judge and the jury. Judges and juries have different roles depending on the case or the type of law that we're dealing with. But just remember, basically speaking, that a jury is a group of people that hear the evidence in a criminal case and decide guilt or innocence. They are the ones that are determining whether or not the defendant in a criminal case is actually guilty or not of the crime they're accused of. Judges can be there to provide instructions or to move the process along or in some cases where there is no jury, like in a civil case, the judge is going to apply the law or come up with a decision on their own, and keep the process moving forward that way. There's also a number of important terms that I want to make sure that you know. The most important of these is this idea of precedent. So precedent, as you can read on the screen, is a ruling that sets a guideline. So what this means is, this is something that is really important to how our court system works. When a judge makes a decision on something, sometimes that decision can be established as a precedent. That essentially means is that the law will be applied in the future in the way that that judge decided it. You, in your U.S. history classes, learned about several precedent-setting cases. Cases like Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Education were important to our story historically because they established precedents. They basically shaped how the law was going to be applied for years and years to come after that. Think about Plessy versus Ferguson, which established a precedent that essentially said segregation was okay. This is the decision that allowed Jim Crow laws and segregation to happen in the United States for most of the early 20th century. And that was only changed by establishing another precedent, another decision by another court in Brown versus Board of Education. So you can see how these court decisions can have huge impact through this idea of precedent. It's a judge using an earlier ruling to make a decision about how the law should be applied now. Really, really important stuff. Another term that you need to be able to understand and distinguish is jurisdiction. This is, of course, right to hear a case, and there's two types of it. There's original jurisdiction and appellate jurisdiction. Original jurisdiction, think about what that word original means, first time. Original jurisdiction describes courts that hear a trial for the first time. So when a person is accused of a crime, or if a civil case is being resolved for the first time, that trial or that case is going to be held at an original jurisdiction court. Its own role and its own responsibilities. As you might know, the verdict at the end of a trial doesn't necessarily have to be the end of the story, because people can appeal decisions by courts in this country. And this is where the appellate jurisdiction courts come in. An appeal is essentially a request to review a trial, look at a trial again and make sure that it happened fairly and correctly. So when you appeal something is when you basically say, I don't like the decision that came out of the original jurisdiction trial court, and I want someone to look at that and make sure that it was done correctly. This is what appellate jurisdiction and appeals courts do. So original jurisdiction courts are the trial courts. They hear the trial for the first time, and appellate jurisdiction is appeals court. They will review a case if an appeal is requested and will try and determine whether or not the trial the first time around was conducted appropriately. Our court system also permits the courts to review actions of the government to determine whether or not they're constitutional or not. And this is called judicial review. Judicial review is a really important check and balance of the court system, and it essentially allows the courts to declare or strike down whether or not something is constitutional or not. So an action can be reviewed by the court. Anything, president's action, a law passed by Congress, anything like that can be reviewed by the courts. They can look at the action and compare it to what the Constitution says is appropriate, and decide whether or not that action should be allowed to continue. This is the main way that the judicial branch checks and balances the other branches of government, and it has historically been an important tool for keeping rights and liberties and protections preserved in this country. And I'll leave you with one more chart just as a way to show to you that we have two levels of court systems in this country. One is the federal court system, and the other is the state court system. I want to make sure that you know that in our way of doing things in the United States, most of the sort of go-to things that you're thinking about courts and what courts do in terms of hearing trials, even serious trials like murder cases and stuff like that, are going to happen at the state level. The state courts are going to handle most of the criminal cases and civil cases between people. But that doesn't mean that the federal courts, which include the Supreme Court and other levels of federal courts, don't have an important job, because they do plenty of important things, and you can read through the list on the left-hand side of your screen to get some specifics about what the federal courts actually do.